We're going to read a passage now from Matthew, which really is speaking about representing God. The Pharisees thought they were God's representatives. They had a monopoly on the word, on the truth, on the law. And so they were quite surprised when Jesus increasingly was gaining popularity, and he was saying, I have come from the Father to show you what God the Father is like. And it didn't always compare well with what the Pharisees were representing God, how they represented God. So we're going to read from Matthew 23. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to the disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so you must be careful to do everything they tell you. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassels on their robes long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have people call them Rabbi. But you are not to be called Rabbi, for you have only one master, and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth Father, for you have one Father, and he's in heaven. Nor are you to be called teacher, for you have one teacher, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. It's a very challenging passage. And the Pharisees and the lawyers of the day certainly found it so, because in this increasing tension between representing God through the Pharisees, through the law, and the way they were, compared to the way Jesus said it should be, the way we should shine with God's love and grace and healing and helpfulness and encouraging. There's such a difference, and they were so put out. They thought they were the representatives, true representatives of God. And then on comes this upstart, if you like, and seems to challenge the very core of their existence. It's a bit like having Ofsted. Jesus creates a situation where he's saying, look at the Pharisees and look at me. And this is the test, really. Who represents God? The representatives of God's laws and ways are shown up sadly lacking in their case, giving the wrong impression of what God is like or what he requires of us. So we have a challenge before us today. We're not all Pharisees, we're not all leaders, but we're all servants of God, we're all Christians, and we represent God today to people around us. How do we measure up? Does he shine from our faces? Do we lift people into fresh hope and positivity? I'm interested in people's conversations, and some that I have with others sometimes. We meet, we tend to be on the negative side, don't we? Oh, bit dull today, isn't it? Isn't it cold? What's happening to our weather? Of course, it's all to do with the environment, isn't it? And the government's probably to blame as well. Why don't they give us more money? Why is the cost of living going up? Have you noticed all the suffering there is in the world? And we tend to go along with that, don't we? Oh, yeah. Can we not be God's representatives? Can we not find a way of putting positives into those conversations? Can we try to encourage one another and somehow be God's representatives? So, I want to speak this morning on 3 P's. The position we find ourselves in, the practice we do compared to the Pharisees, how much like them we are, and the presentation that we could be giving as Christians today. So Jesus, in the position, Jesus outlines the position of God's representatives. Just remind ourselves in the first 3 verses of what Jesus said about the position they were in as the Pharisees and the position we're in. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, I imagine it's the same one up there, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so you must obey them and do everything that they tell you. It's an awesome position to be in, and Jesus is saying, well, the Pharisees are in this position, and it's very important that you take notice of what they say about God, but not what they do. So we have this awesome responsibility to our friends, to our neighbours, to members of our family, to give that impression of what God is like. Are we attractive? Are we beautiful? Are we clean? Are we tidy? We do our best. And some people dress up for church. Some people dress down for church. I come from a farmer's tradition, so on Sundays we put on our Sunday best. I'm afraid that stuck with me. So when I come to church, I tend to dress up, put on my best clothes, show the finery. Used to wear hats, or women used to wear hats. No hats here this morning. Other people like to dress down to go to church. Put away the work clothes. I mean, farmers have got to put away their work clothes anyway, haven't they? They couldn't come to church smelly. But some people working in offices say, well, I'll come in casuals. I'll be fashionable, even, if that's possible for some of us older ones. But these things are to do with outward appearance, aren't they? They give rise to comment and tittle-tattle, really, to represent God really to the people around us is something that happens within us. There's an inner glow, something that happens when we spend time with God. It's not the outward appearance that's the most important thing. It's in our hearts. But we are in that position. I really believe we're in that position where we have this huge responsibility of representing God to the ordinary people around us. And sometimes it's difficult in the family situation as well, where people really know you, know what you're really like. Quite a challenge to be in that position. So let's turn to the practice that was going on in the days of Jesus. Jesus warns against following the practice of God's representatives. And so we carry on through the passage at the end of verse 3. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move against them. There's two areas here that Jesus is talking about. It's the hard-heartedness of the Pharisees in general and the lawyers towards the people of that day. There was a controlling spirit amongst them. They just didn't seem to have a heart for people generally. They were sought to control by the rules and the regulations that they seem to find so many and attach them to the Ten Commandments, extra ones, things to keep people down, to control people. Today, it's not much different, is it, really? We have rulers, we have situation in Zambia with Mugabe at the moment. When people get power, when they get in that position of influence, it's so easy to rule people, to control people. So we get managers at work. There's such a thing today as human slavery and trafficking, sex trade. And there's so many people who are being controlled by others. Many find they're in a situation where they cannot break free from the situation they find themselves in, where other people, maybe members of the family or at work, just dominate them totally, and they cannot break free. So again, a challenge to us as Christians. Can we do anything about this? We are so often so busy in ourselves, in running our own lives, to be able to have time to help others break free. Jesus identified the poor. He loved being able to help people, to set people free, to point people to God, to heal. And so he challenges us today not to be people who control, but who set others free. And then, so they were, in that sense, very hard-hearted Pharisees. Then the second warning, really, that Jesus gives about practice is to do with promoting oneself. Look at me. I'm important. I'm holy. I'm good. I go to church. Look at me. And certainly the Pharisees knew how to do this in big time, with their putting the scriptures in a box on their foreheads, long tassels on their robes, taking the important places in society, enjoying the fact that people thought well of them. Of course, we don't do that, do we? But isn't it a fact that when we come to church even, we like to be said, well, you're looking good, or appreciated for what we do. It's not so good when you do something and nobody seems to notice, nobody says thank you. It seems to strike something inside. Some people give others a hug. You think, well, yes, I'm a member of the family, I'm really there, and they really think I'm somebody to be loved. That can go wrong as well. Sometimes you expect somebody to give you a hug and they walk straight by, seem to miss you out, and they give somebody else a hug. You think, what's all that about? We like to be noticed. We like to feel that we're getting it right and that people appreciate us. I know in my own life, sometimes relationships seem to get a bit too tense and then they have to be pulled back. And that's hurtful. That can happen. Of course, the most important thing is that we don't do things to please other people. It's nice to be appreciated. It's nice to be seen. It's nice to be noticed, to be thanked for what you do. But it's not the most important thing. Because there's another way of finding fulfillment. And that's what we're moving on to. How can we be truly God's representatives and get it right? Get the motivation right. Not to look at me, but to see God through me. And so Jesus goes on in the scriptures that we have before us in Matthew 23. But you are not called Rabbi, for you have only one master. You are all brothers. Do not call anyone on earth Father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called teacher, for you have one teacher, the Messiah. And then he goes on to speak about being humble and representing God in that way. So I've just put down 3 things which will help us not to draw attention so much to ourselves, but for people to see God in us. Choose to put him first in all we think and say and do. That's the most important thing. God's will for your life, irrespective of what people might say or think about you. We can endure criticism. We can endure persecution even. But so long as we're doing God's will and putting his will first. There are so many opportunities today to please ourselves. There's so much encouragement to find yourself, to find your identity. Truly, the scriptures seem to say that we can only really find ourselves when we find ourselves in God's purposes for us, when we find ourselves in Christ, when we've been forgiven, when we've been filled with his Spirit. We then become the person that God has created us to be. There's a sense of peace and joy and contentment in knowing that in everything we put his will first. There's a program on quite recently, within the last few days, about multimedia, or at least about the Facebook and Twitter and all the things the younger people seem to get up to today of communicating through the computer and so on. And they get so upset if they're not accepted, if they're not wearing the right clothes, if they're not the right weight. It's so important to our younger generation, it seems, to be in the vein of being accepted, as we were talking about just now. But dear young people, those of you who are here this morning, get God in your life. What is really important for all of us is to know that he is the source of our life, of our joy, of our peace. Put his will first. It's not important to think of ourselves as a teacher or a master or a father. Jesus says, be humble and serve the Lord with all your hearts. So choose him first and then worship him always. The people of the day in this passage knew that Jesus would disappear at times. He would spend whole nights in prayer. He would spend time. He would get up early and worship God. He would take God on, if you like, into himself. He would know the Father's will. He would be filled with the Father's heart. And that made such a difference to the way in which he ministered to those around him, to the way in which he could show God and enable people to know God, because he spent time in worshipping God. So it's important for us too, not just to put God first in our lives, but to spend time in loving him, worshipping him, seeing him in all the ways that he shows himself to us. It's as though sometimes our eyes are opened in this wonderful world, though it's filled with suffering, to see in the natural world the wonder of creation, to worship God in the countryside, to worship God for the scriptures, to worship God for his grace that we've been singing about this morning, to spend time in worship, not just on a Sunday, but to worship. Put him first and worship him with all our hearts. And then thirdly, then it is possible, I believe then it is possible to be able to reach out to people around us, to be positive, to show the love of Christ through our own lives, through our faces, through the way in which we really care for people's needs. It's a simple message, but it's a challenging one to represent God to the people of today. The Pharisees were in the right position, but they didn't practice the right things. Jesus came and shows us what God is really like, and was able to work out to those around him the love and the purposes of God, to set people free. So they had a choice. We have a choice to be like Jesus or to please ourselves, to be humble in him, seek only his approval, and shine as Moses shone when he came down the mountain. So let us go out and shine with his radiance coming from his inner presence, which we receive through worshipping him day by day. And let us in this position practice the presentation of his love to all whom we meet day by day. We are God's representatives.